The final kind of asserts we're going to look at in this module is how we check that our code throws the correct exceptions. So we're going to look at some tests against our calculator class here that we saw earlier in the module, and we're going to test this divide method here. So the first test we're going to write is that it should error when we try and divide something by 0. So to check that a piece of code throws an exception, we still use the assert.that method, but this looks a bit different now. The first parameter is a delegate to the code we want to execute that we expect to throw the exception. So here we're saying when we call the divide method with these parameters that we should throw an exception. So here we're not specifying the type of exception that we want, we're just saying that if any exception is thrown, then our assert will pass. So let's run this. And our test passes, but there's a subtle problem here. If we have a look at our divide method here, we can see that we get this argument out of range exception thrown if we pass in a value more than 100. And we can see here that we're passing in a value of 200, so we're actually going to get the argument out of range exception thrown here, as opposed to the divide by 0 exception that we're expecting in our test. So checking for any kind of exception is not usually a good idea. With NUnit, we can use the throws.typeof and then pass the type of exception that we're expecting. So here we're being a lot more explicit about the kind of exception that we want. So let's run this. And notice that our test is actually failing. We've expected a divide by 0 exception, but we're actually getting an argument out of range exception. And that's because the value we've passed in is more than 100, so we're getting this argument out of range exception thrown. So we can see here that our first test was actually not testing the correct thing. So we can fix this. Let's just pass 99. Now our divide method will throw the divide by 0 exception, and our test will pass. So let's write a test now for this check for the value being more than 100. So we'll start off with this version of the test. So we're dividing a value more than 200, and we're not dividing by 0 this time, and we're expecting an argument out of range exception, because this value is more than 100. So let's run this. And our test passes. But there's also a subtle problem with this test. If we look at our divide method here, there's a deliberate bug here. We're throwing an argument out of range exception for the by parameter here, when it should be for the value parameter here. So we can be more explicit still. We're going to divide 200 by 2 as before, and as before we're going to say throws type of argument out of range exception. But this time we're going to use some additional functionality from NUnit using the .with property here. We're going to add an additional constraint, and here we're going to use this matches method, which allows us to specify a predicate. So here we're additionally checking that our argument out of range exception, represented by this x parameter here, has a parameter name of value. So if we run this, it's going to fail because we are setting the parameter here, the parameter name here, incorrectly here to by. So let's fix this, and we'll change it to the correct parameter name, which is value here. So now our test is checking that we get an argument out of range exception, and the exception's param name property is equal to value. And now we can see our test passes.